Okay, so I'm just going to jump right into this series on Martin Heidegger's thought by beginning with being and time. And what I hope to kind of provide is a very basic introduction to some of the more essential texts in Heidegger's oeuvre, and a very kind of slow burn, slow read through some of these more fundamental works by Heidegger. So I am working from an older HarperCollins version of the text. It's a translation by John Macquarie and Edward Robinson. And what I hope to kind of cover today is just a very basic kind of interpretation of the first 35 pages or so, which is the introduction, and more specifically, part one of the introduction. And I just want to kind of provide some basic grounding for what I think Heidegger is trying to say and do here, and to provide a kind of starting off point for a general series in which we explore the text in depth and kind of move through Heidegger's very complex, but at the same time, I think, deeply human form of thought. So let's just jump right in. What do I kind of think this text is attempting to do, and how do I think Heidegger begins? Well, on a very general level, I think that Heidegger begins by way of a general philosophical critique. He follows this up with a kind of assumed historical critique, specifically of modernity. And finally, he moves in this very first part in this early section to a more positive argument in defense of being itself. The subject on the table is kind of the general phenomenon of existence, which Heidegger will define as being. The principal problem that Heidegger identifies, and what's really going to instigate the entire creation of the text and the project itself, is that, simply put, we do not have an adequate understanding of what being is. When we use the term being, we don't know what it actually defines. To put it another way, and as Heidegger frames it, being is hidden from us. Part of our assumed responsibility of human creatures in this world, therefore, is to reveal being to ourselves. Heidegger then moves to kind of dismiss three broad philosophical objections from the outset. These objections he kind of sees as acting as theoretical roadblocks to any real investigation into the essential characteristics of being. So the first of these kind of roadblocks that Heidegger wants to address and dismiss is this idea that being is a universal and therefore a given concept, and therefore it does not need description or definition. Heidegger thinks that this is untrue, and that a real definition of being is lacking, that it's hidden from us, and again, that it is our duty to reveal that definition. The second and related roadblock is this idea that being itself is indefinable, that even if we want to define it, the nature of being is so kind of complicated, diffuse, or beyond our understanding, that any attempt to define it is kind of doomed from the get-go. Heidegger again wants to dismiss this idea. Finally, the third idea that he wants to kind of get rid of from the very get-go is this idea that being is self-evident and therefore does not need definition. Again, he thinks that being is not an obvious concept or category, and that to describe being as obvious is to miss the point. That in fact, it is among the most obscure concepts and ideas in our entire vocabulary, and to really designate a definition of being requires a kind of significantly more thorough and grounded understanding than what we are capable of now. Further, Heidegger launches this kind of critique that hangs in the background. He mentions it a little bit here, and it will become much more apparent as the text goes on. But there's this idea that modernity itself has brought with it very specific problems for the human subject. And therefore, a critique of modernity hangs throughout the background of this initial section and throughout this entire text and much of Heidegger's kind of greater oeuvre. Assumed in this kind of critique of modernity is a certain alienation that the human subject experiences from their own being. Heidegger will point eventually to the growth of technology, the domination of reason and rationality, a kind of Cartesian concept of philosophy, and the overall attempt to overcome nature as kind of being at the heart of this modern problem of alienation and sources of modernity's frustration with its encounter or lack thereof with being. As a result, in Heidegger's definition, being itself has been eclipsed and obscured. This contemporary blindness means that we must formulate our inquiry of being from the ground up. This will involve, according to Heidegger, in part a resurrection of certain strands of ancient thought, especially derived from Aristotle, that involve metaphysical and ontological considerations. But even this offers incomplete and unresolved dilemmas, and so with this reappropriation of the ancients will follow the development of a needed and new method. We do this because we seek an understanding of being itself. According to Heidegger, we are naturally compelled, since this is the most basic and most concrete question that we as human beings can ask of ourselves and our world. How, then, do we go about formulating an inquiry concerning being itself? Well, according to Heidegger, he first makes a categorical separation between being and beings. Depending on our subject of inquiry, the formulation of the question will determine our method. Or another way to put this is that there will be a difference in investigating being as a general phenomenon than there will be in investigating beings as separate subject categories or separate sciences. More specifically, the investigation of being itself as a general phenomenon will be somehow separate and special when compared to the investigation of any given being or beings. The question is complicated, of course, since any formulation we make as beings will necessarily be a self-formulation on being itself. We encounter here the problem of self-referentiality. We are simply too close to our own being to adequately define it. We are simply close to our own selves to understand something that is just so essential to every aspect of our existence and understanding. Heidegger wants to work out this confusion and complication by way of a kind of concept that he calls Dasein. He asserts the priority of Dasein as a privileged site of being unique to human experience. Dasein is to be considered as the place where being meets itself, where being greets itself, where being finds itself to be a problem, where being finds itself to be an issue and a kind of question. Dasein describes the experience of being comporting itself towards existence. It is being that understands itself in terms of its own existence. And it is because of this that it is unique to the human subject. Heidegger will come to define Dasein as a kind of, quote, being there, unquote, or as a type of sheer, quote, presence, end quote. Heidegger's effort here is in part the displacement of the Enlightenment subject of rationality. He wants to replace the I of this subject with something more elementary, diffuse, and essential. One of the central figures that Heidegger will kind of aim at in this overall critique will be Descartes. So in part, Heidegger wants to train us to think through our own essence, our own being, differently than we have in the past. What Heidegger is offering is a type of therapy of sorts. It's an attempt to resolve being to itself, to develop a method through and by being, by which being can come to understand itself more thoroughly and therefore more clearly. Heidegger wants to provide a method by which we can work through the self-referentiality of our own being without falling into the pitfalls of Enlightenment thought. What is at stake here is twofold. Firstly, in adding needed transparency and clarity to our general capacity to field any and all inquiries, Heidegger is attempting to resolve certain kind of confusions and complications that are internal to the structure of the way we go about asking questions of the world. Another way to put this is that we are thus trying to make our inquiries aware of their most basic and essential premises. without which they suffer from an internal and crippling blindness. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, by way of assumption, Heidegger relies on the notion that as individuals, our being is made less without a proper understanding of itself. When our own being is hidden from us, we exist less fully. To exist as completely human, therefore, demands a relationship to being that we have yet to fully explore or know. So what do I think the main takeaway points from this introduction, or this very early part one even to the introduction, really are? Well, firstly, I think today Heidegger wants to claim that we do not know what being is. We do not know how to properly address or speak of being, and yet we are nonetheless compelled to know, address, and speak of the phenomenon. Thus, a certain type of approach to being is required in order to reveal being in full. This approach will be special and different from pre-existing modes of thought, in that it will involve the development of an understanding of the principle of Dasein. By way of Dasein, a space is cleared for a new type of thinking, a thinking that rejects the basic premises and constraints of Enlightenment thought and Cartesian rationality. This thinking has the capacity to reveal being to us. More generally, this thinking has the capacity to reveal being to itself. On a more general level, I think some considerations to take away from this early text. One of the things that will probably strike the reader immediately is how highly idiosyncratic Heidegger's use of language is. He appropriates and transforms quotidian terms and kind of more common phrases into this high philosophical style, kind of sublimating the common and everyday, and imbibing it with something kind of almost, I wouldn't say mysterious, but certainly philosophical. And in part, what Heidegger is trying to do is redeem our everyday experience and kind of add to it the philosophical value and depth that it's really already owed. The second kind of consideration I think to take away from this work on kind of just a much more general level is that it is a very dense text, like much of Heidegger's other work. And I think that this density necessitates a certain meditative approach. And what do I mean by that? Well, I think that one needs to approach Heidegger with a willingness to think differently than a lot of other, approaches to philosophy or nonfiction or just literature more generally. I think with this text in particular, you really need to take your time and to embroil yourself in the kind of beautiful and nuanced contradictions of being that Heidegger will kind of map out slowly and very surely as kind of a slow burn. I think that this is the type of work that, if consumed properly, however, has the real capacity not only to open up and deepen one's relationship to the greater and outside world, but really open up and deepen one's relationship to oneself. So what do I suggest? I suggest fundamentally and ultimately to let this text stand as less of a text at all and more of a kind of encounter, as a kind of experience. And we will certainly talk about that as it relates to Heidegger's philosophy as we move on. But for now, I would say it's very important to have patience and to expect to be transformed in your engagement with this work. Thank you. I hope this helps a little bit, and I hope that it provided some interesting context for some of Heidegger's thought. Take care.